Hello, and welcome to Terrorism. This is POLS 3711, and we're looking at Chapter 1, Defining Terrorism. We're just going to go over some of these few concepts pretty quickly. So, first, your book talks about the concept of understanding political extremism. So again, we're going over some of these concepts of definitions. They're really, it's kind of been difficult to pin these things down because you've got governments have their own concepts and definitions, and these definitions can vary between governments, sometimes even between agencies within a government. People have their own concept of terrorism. Uh, and also within academia, we can have our own concepts of terrorism, though typically within academia, we try to pin those down. So, from an academic standpoint, we try to define it by breaking it down to the different types. So, we'll look at political extremism first. In order to understand terrorism, we first have to understand that it's a form of political extremism, right? First, a terrorist, before he becomes a terrorist, he or she is first drawn towards these political extremist ideologies, right? So defining extremism, it's a radical expression of political values. Again, it's a precursor to terrorism, and it's the primary catalyst or and the motivation for terrorist behavior. Um, it's important to understand that just because somebody is a political extremist, no matter how radical they may seem or how strong they hold these views, they don't necessarily um, um, translate into terrorism unless they act. Okay. The world of the extremists. They set themselves apart as protectors of, or the true heirs of a legacy, right? So, in other words, they feel that their particular worldview, their point of view, is the one that's protecting this legacy that they hold. Um, so we can think of, for example, different people who have particular religious views or racial views of racial purity. Okay. They have clear sense of a mission, purpose, or righteousness. They're convinced that their way is the only way. Okay, they create a worldview that sets them apart from society. Again, it's their way is the only correct way, so therefore everybody else is wrong, right? There are common characteristics of violent extremists. They are intolerant. They have moral absolutes. Everything is in black and whites. There is no deviating from their point of view. There are no exceptions of any kind, right? There are broad, sweeping conclusions, generalizations about groups of people, right? Uh, they create a new language and conspiratorial beliefs that the government or big pharma or various people, whatever, might be out to get them or conspire to overthrow them, etc. Again, the difference about political extremists, again, what crosses the line between having political extremist views and terrorism is acts, right? You can say engage in breaking windows or destroying property or these kinds of things, and that's not terrorism. It could be illegal activities, okay, but it's when you cross the line and start hurting people or killing people that it becomes terrorist behavior. So we're going to look at formal and informal definitions. So here's a sampling of some formal definitions. Again, there's been the effort to formally define terrorism, and this is very critical. There's a range of definitions that vary among governments, as I talked about before. Defining terrorism in the United States. So we think about it, the United States has not adopted a single definition. As I talked about before, there are various definitions. We can look between the police department, we can look at between the FBI, the CIA, etc. They might have different definitions. Reliance is based on the definitions that were developed by various agencies. So the common elements of varying definitions can be used to construct a definitional model. So we kind of try to combine these definitions to sort of create a definition that seems to work best. So again, we look at the types of terrorism, okay, and there are four main types. There's state terrorism, dissident terrorism, religious terrorism, and international terrorism. And we will be talking about each of these and breaking them down throughout the semester. Okay, so the objectives and goals of terrorists. Wait, just a second. So if you want to look a little bit more, make sure you read through in the chapter, and I'll talk a little bit about that on page 10. Okay, so like state terrorism being terrorism from above, and dissident terrorism, terrorism from below, religious terrorism, terrorism that's inspired by religious beliefs, and international terrorism spills over into the world stage, like ISIS and that kind of thing. Okay, so the objectives and goals of terrorism. These are their typical objectives. They want to change the existing order. Okay, so they feel like there's something going on, either locally, maybe within the state that they live, within the region, or globally, that they feel is going on that is wrong, and they want that to change. Perhaps they want to change things and create a psychological disruption. They're looking to socially disrupt, or they're looking to create a revolutionary environment. Maybe they want to literally just change the whole government and global order. Okay, so again, your book will talk about that on page 11. Okay, so please take a look at that. So again, when we're looking at the objectives and goals of terrorism, they're always going to be playing to the audience. Okay, so when they're doing that, we have to think about what their objectives are, the victims, and the constituencies. Okay, they want to make sure that they are laying out what their objectives are, okay, and they are going to be putting that out to the world. But we also have to keep in mind their victims, and who are their constituencies? Who are they trying to get this message out to? Terrorists will adapt their methods and targets to the characteristics of their champion group and their environment. So these are examples of their audiences, okay? Politically apathetic people, they want people who are apathetic to wake up, okay? Government and their allies, they want people who they feel are in power, and the people who support them to become aware of what they are doing and to get them to change their behavior. potential supporters, people who might support the terrorists, to see what they're doing and perhaps maybe support them financially, or people who might be potentially recruited. Okay, this is, for example, ISIS would engage in specific violent behaviors and it would spread all over the internet, and that would be one way that they would get their message out, and people would find ways to get to Syria or um, etc. To join up with ISIS. Okay, and another example of an audience would be confirmed supporters, right? So they would use that as a way to sort of entrench support. Say, see, we're doing this and we're doing right by you. Okay. Terrorists are freedom fighters. So you've heard this quote, I'm sure, before. Perspective one, we have 4 quotations. One person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. And so basically that notion comes from the fact that, you know, in history, sometimes you will see that a government doesn't like it when there are people who are fighting against oppression, and they will often label those people as terrorists when in fact they might be rightly fighting an oppressive government, right? So they might label those people as terrorists. But it could be that there are people who are legitimately terrorists, right? So um, it can become dicey to try to discern who is who, and sometimes history will play the judge of that. The second one man willing to throw away his life is enough to terrorize 1,000. So this concept came from the Chinese military philosopher Wu Qi, and this concept was also associated with Sun Tzu and also associated with Mao Zedong of China. Okay, and basically it comes from this concept that people who are willing to basically just throw away their entire life for the sake of a cause, and have no fear, right? Could potentially, that's terrifying to people. Okay, so that's just one concept of that, and they talk more about that on page 14. Okay, extremism in defense of liberty is no vice. Okay, and they talk about this again on page 11, and that's was a concept by Senator Barry Goldwater. And here's another one. It became necessary to destroy the town to save it. And this is a quote associated that had been attributed to a statement by an American officer during the Vietnam War. They use it to justify the hardships that they impose to perceive an enemy, but also on their championing of a group. So basically, it's this concept that sometimes you have to do awful things, destroy a town, destroy an area in order to save the people, or etc., who are within that town. In other words, it can be used to justify acts of terror, right? And so it can be dicey, right, depending upon which perspective you look at it, right? So the people in the town may not necessarily perceive it that way. The people in the neighboring town might not perceive it that way, but the people who are doing the destroying might perceive it that way, right? So again, these are all quotes and perceptions that, depending upon one's perspective, can be taken in different ways. Okay, again, for more information, look on page 14. terrorists are freedom fighters. Perspective 2. So the terrorists, obviously the terrorists, those people are going to be the perpetrators, and they want to attract attention for their cause, okay? And they think that they're just. Everything that they're doing, they think they're doing it for a just cause. They are never the perpetrators of some ill deed. Their hands are always clean, because they're acting in the right. If they are doing it for a religious reason, they believe they are sanctioned by God to do this. Okay, and in the end, they believe that they are fighting for the rights of an oppressed people. Okay, the supporter is basically the patron of the terrorist. All right, and the supporter can be used to cover for the terrorist. They can be used to get out the message of the terrorist. Pardon me, I have allergies. And they can be used to help spin the terrorists' acts to a larger audience through television, through the internet. They can also sometimes help provide financial support. Okay, then of course you have the victim. There are the victims of the violence. They will rarely, if ever, obviously support the terrorist activities, and they are the innocent, oftentimes collateral damage of the terrorist attacks. Then you have the target, and the target is typically a symbolic symbol, and they are usually very purposely targeted. Sometimes they're a political target, a political person. Sometimes, if they are targeted appropriately, they can be used to help garner sympathy for their cause. If it's done properly, when the media reports on the fact that this person has been targeted for a terrorist attack, they can actually end up garnering sympathy for the fact that if the media tells a story and they can say, they can garner sympathy and say that, well, this person, was the cause of, say, genocide for this particular group, or, was known for killing many children, or, this kind of thing. They might have the effect of garnering sympathy for the terrorist group. Okay. And all of that so far is on page 15. Then we're moving on to page 16. The onlooker. The onlookers tend to be this broad audience. They can be a variety of group. They could be sympathizers. They might be affected directly at the scene, or indirectly. Okay, they may sympathize. For example, we can think about, if you watch any of the video from 9/11, you can see lots of people who were just standing out in the streets for a very long time, watching the whole thing happen, even before the towers came down, and then after they did, right? Just standing there in horror. Those people were onlookers, for example. Okay. The analysts. So we have a variety of different types of analysts. We have political analysts, we have political leaders, we have, we have media experts and academic experts. Okay, and they each will bring different things to the table that they can provide. However, sometimes there's things that can get lost in the shuffle and provide biases in relation to analysis if it's done improperly. And for that, I encourage you to look on page 16. Things such as emotional responses, that's very important. political associations, when pundits of different types get on there, when they have political leanings, that can be very detrimental to analysis. Okay, so perspective 3, terrorists, terrorism or freedom fighting. So again, in some perspectives, extremist beliefs and terrorist methods are logical and necessary, as well as rational and justifiable. So again, whether we're talking about a government or a extremist group, they can find justifications for it. So, for example, if they're an extremist group, obviously they're going to say the government or some sectarian group with might be oppressing them in some way. And so, therefore, they see no other alternative but to act in a violent fashion because they've tried every other method to try to deal with these people, and they've been left no choice but to act in a violent manner in order to secure their rights. Okay? And the flip can be true with the government, right? The government can say, we've tried everything to deal with these people and we've been left no option but to act in a legitimate, in a violent fashion in order to secure the security the security of our people, I guess. Okay. And so they will try to justify their actions through means of self-preservation, security, etc. Okay, and they talk more about that on page 16. Okay, so the political violence matrix. They talk about this on page 17. There's a nice little figure 1.1, okay, that you can look at for a visual reference. Combatants, non-combatants, and the use of force. That's the definitional and ethical issues that are not always clear when we're using these terms. They talk about total war, unrestricted terrorism, and it breaks it down for you there. Okay. Again, combatant, that refers to conventional, unconventional adversaries who engage in armed conflict. So basically, again, that's members of the regular military, irregular guerrilla gunfighting units. So basically, when you think of going to war, people who are, if you think of the United States military, anybody who's in the military, right? You know, the Marines, the Army, when they go into regular war, or if they're going into war, they could be engaged with irregular guerrilla fighting units, which they talk about on page. Hold on, I saw them talking about that. About guerrilla war on page 6. Okay. So, because guerrilla units are considered are part of that. They're considered combatants. Okay. Non-combatants, that includes civilians who have no connection to the military or other security forces. So basically, that would be like you and me, if provided you're not in the military and engaged in actual combat. So even if you were in the military and you're just walking down the street, you would be considered a non-combatant at that point. Okay. Combatants and non-combatant targets. This is indiscriminate force. We're talking about indiscriminate force. That's the application of force against a target without attempting to limit the level of force or the degree of destruction of the target. So basically, that means you're just dropping bombs and not even thinking about the strength of the bomb versus, the size of the property, right? So, for example, maybe dropping a giant bomb in a small village, right? And how the impact of that would be on that small village, right? If you're just trying to get one person, okay? And discriminate force is a more surgical use of limited force. So that would be, for example, we have something called smart bombs, right? which would be something that's much more highly targeted. So if we're trying to just get like one person, um, and we could try to use something like that in a more targeted attack, right? That would be much more symmetrical to an area, so we would have less collateral damage, okay, and not hurt other people that it's not intended to hurt. So basically, anything that's not a smart bomb would be considered like a dumb bomb. They're not um, as like say computer targeted, where there isn't somebody manning it, where we can be sure that it's going exactly where it's supposed to be. It's uh, not the right size, all of that kind of thing. So um, uh, these are considerations that we need to think about when we're talking about indiscriminate force and discriminate force, because you can really cause much more damage with indiscriminate force than with discriminate force. Okay, so if you want, you can go to the student resources that I posted for this text. I believe it's in the it should be in your syllabus. There's e-flashcards, web quizzes, and things like that that you can check out, and other videos if you're interested. And that's it. Please make sure you have read and all of that. And if you have any questions, please contact me. Bye.